All right. So, as was said, for the past few months, I've been a Vossius Fellow, and the Vossius Center has given me a very generous amount of money to conduct a very specific type of research, which I ended up formulating as astral magic trends in the early modern period. Now, I realize that this is a general audience, and maybe not everyone here is familiar or aware of what do we mean when we speak of magic in an academic or in a historical context. So before I get into what exactly I've been doing here for the past few months, I'm just going to take a step back and just lead everybody through some basic definitions so that we don't get lost. So, without getting bogged down in excessively academic considerations, let us simply assume the reasonable position that throughout all of human culture, and in particular the Latin West, there has always been a certain set of ideas and practices which, from within this culture and this society, we have called magic. If we accept this, then magic, whatever that might be, is just a part of culture as anything else is. And as such, is historifiable. So, we can write a history of magic in the same way that we can write a history of religion, without necessarily needing to believe whether magic or religion is real. It's simply something that exists in society. It leaves a mark on history, leaves a mark on cultures, and so we get to study it. But magic is a complex category because most often it is characterized and defined from a negative perspective. Usually in the West, it's theological and academic authorities who tend to describe what magic is by things that they don't like or that they want to see condemned. Simultaneously, we do have individuals who self-proclaim themselves as magicians and will have discourses positive towards magic. So there are several discourses within magic. And not only this, there are actually several different forms of magic, many of which entirely incompatible with each other from a cosmological perspective. So it's a fragmented category, which is what makes it very interesting, but also very complex. So one way academics have to navigate this complicated category is by using certain academic artifices and tricks to make our lives easier. And one way we can do this is by dividing magic into two general tendencies: folk magic and learned magic. Now, these two categories aren't symmetrical to each other, and you can't even divide them accurately. There is no place in history or culture where you can say folk magic ends and learned magic begins. These are just two sociological extremes of magic that we like to talk about and make our lives easier with. But we can define these very simply. If we take one side of the spectrum, folk magic, we can define this as mostly an oral tradition, typical of undereducated or non-formally educated individuals. It tends to be very pragmatical in nature, dealing with health, physical protection, financial stability, if it happens in a rural context, insurance of crops or protection of animals, stuff like that. Typically, folk magic also is a semi-open practice, and it's not actually distinguishable from local notions of folk religion or folk medicine, which itself are also academic categories. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we have learned magic, and this is essentially a literary tradition. It is thus typical of educated and affluent individuals, being a learned tradition, a literary tradition. People who engage in this do need to be able to read and write. And while it does not abstain from practical and pragmatic preoccupations, it also offers loftier ambitions. So learned magic oftentimes will prescribe certain practices or habits for spiritual elevation or intellectual enlightenment, the dominion over elements or spirits, which tend to make it distinguishable from folk magic. Now, what's next? Focusing now on learned magic, one way to define this historically, as Frank Lassen puts it, the history of learned magic in the West may be understood in part as a series of attempts to reconcile theologically problematic practices and ideas with Christian orthodoxy. So this means that as a literary tradition, learned magic evolves with culture and history. And as such, new conceptions of learned magic, new ideas on learned magic, and new forms of learned magic tend to crystallize every time there is a large set of information external from the Latin West that all of a sudden becomes available. It is the conflicts and discourses and the reconceptualizations and the understanding of these external forms of knowledge that oftentimes create new forms of magic. Now, one of these moments where learned magic gets crystallized is in 12th century Toledo. Now, in this time period, in this location, King Alfonso X, the Wise, King of Castile, established a translation school, whose one of the purposes was to translate texts in Arabic and Hebrew into Latin and vernacular. Now, this was a really remarkable endeavor, and a great deal of Greek classical philosophy, medicine, literature that had been preserved in Arabic sources all of a sudden found itself available to the Latin West. This created what can be called legitimately a Renaissance, even though it is not the same Renaissance as we usually refer to when we talk about the Renaissance. It is a Renaissance. And among the many things that this introduction of new information created was the formulation of new forms of learned magic. And usually, academically, we tend to define these new forms of learned magic in the 12th century as three distinct forms. The first of these we refer to as natural magic. Now, natural magic can be understood as the study of properties of natural objects or materials according to establish scientific and cosmological principles. This includes, for example, the study and understanding of occult properties or occult virtues. So, the mysterious properties that some materials or objects or animals might have, which, while being considered entirely natural, somehow rest beyond human understanding. So there are things that are observable, that we can apply, but we don't know their causes. And this gets lumped in as natural magic. Typically, natural magic is not condemned by theological authorities. It's simply an understanding of the natural world. Another form of magic, is astral or image magic, what we'll be focusing on further down. Now, this can be described as a series of techniques and processes for the creation of an object, usually referred to as a talisman, meant to focus or attract the power of a specific celestial body for a specific benefit. So, for example, there is, in this time period and for most of actually the medieval and the early modern period, there is the notion that certain metals have correspondence with certain planets. So if I want to attract the influence of a certain planet, I will grab a metal that is associated with this planet, shape it in a way that is also associated with this planet, and I do this in the day of this planet and at the hour of this planet, creating an optimized object through human artifice that will naturally attract the properties and virtues of this planet. And then I can use this object for whatever it is that I'm using it for. Some talismans are used for medicine. Others are for more mundane purposes, such as attracting women or making soldiers brave. So in principle, in a theoretical sense, astral magic and natural magic actually function by the same mechanisms. The powers that astral magic aims to manipulate are natural in themselves, simply optimized with human artifice. Now, the literary tradition of astral magic does have particularities, as the original text in Arabic that describe this frequently describe the shapes that you're supposed to give to your talismans or the symbols and characters you're supposed to engrave on them. And as these books are translated into vernacular and Latin, these descriptions become pictorial. So during this period also, astral magic becomes associated or creates a certain lexicon of symbols, certain shapes and symbols and tools and arrangements of symbols that become associated with the planets. And this is a pictorial tradition that goes through the medieval period and the early modern period. Now, finally, the last aspect of magic practice we can talk about learned magic is ceremonial or ritual magic. Now, this can be considered techniques for the evocation and communication with non-human supernatural forces. Let's say communication with angels or demons. So this is entirely distinct in its understanding and functioning from the two other forms of magic, meaning that the others are, in essence, explorations of the natural world in a way. This is an active seeking of information not rationally or not available immediately by the exploration of reality as it is in front of us. So this aims to seek information beyond what is immediately perceivable. Curiously, while ceremonial magic is universally condemned by theological authorities, as these texts start communicating with the Latin West and start to be crystallized and formulated into ceremonial magic, they actually become immediately intertwined with liturgical and paraliturgical literature, meaning that actually ceremonial magic is largely a Christian tradition. But out of all the forms of learned magic of the 12th century, it is the one which is more readily condemned by Christian authorities. Now, the last thing we need to know is that, obviously, I'm talking about categories, and again, these are all academic categories for our benefit. There is obviously a continuity between all these things. I've mentioned that natural magic and astral magic, in theory, do function by an understanding and manipulation of naturally occurring properties. But also, certain texts of astral magic, when they describe the characters that you are supposed to etch in your talismans, or the genuine consecrations or incantations that you're supposed to do while consecrating your talismans, do seem to suggest that not all the powers that are involved in the creation of a talisman are natural. That somehow you might be potentially invoking or calling on some kind of spirit that will inhabit your talisman and thus make it powerful, obviously making it very close to ceremonial magic, which deals explicitly with autonomously existing non-human entities. So these are all on the continuum. So now this is all we need to know to move on. So, what have I been doing here for the past few months? What is my research question, and what was I doing? I am a historian of magic. This is what I do. I study the practices, ideas, and literature of magic in specific locations and times. My expertise is early modern Iberia. In doing this, a few years ago, not that long, I found myself in a remote archive in the middle of Spain, a place called Cuenca. And doing research on magic, I ended up finding 2 magic books. Now, this is rather monumental because these were attached to an Inquisition trial from the 17th century belonging to a man called Jerónimo de Liébana. And the Iberian Inquisitions were extremely diligent in dealing with magic and magic literature. You do have several trials dealing with magic. Finding a magic book is extraordinarily rare. They burnt everything. So finding these books is a treasure. A rare window into the mentalities and habits and beliefs of people in the 17th century. So I analyzed these books, and very clearly and very easily they are identifiable as astral magic books. They are talking about the construction of metallic statuettes of different metals according to different planets, and supposed to be done at specific times. So astral magic, no question about it. However, besides these clearly astral magic instructions, all these metallic statuettes, before they were considered to be finished or to be functional as talismans, all of them required consecration within a magic circle and using several conjurations, which are explicitly ceremonial magic practices. So it's not so much an ambiguity of whether this is astral magic with elements of ceremonial magic. This is a clear overlap between the 2 forms of magic. Now, there is another issue, which is, this is odd. This is curious, to say the least. Also because in academic literature, it is usually considered that the peak of popularity of astral magic is the 15th century. That after that, the astral magic loses popularity in light of new forms of magic that come into play with the Renaissance. So this is 2 centuries after that. And this poses, then, a serious question. Are these books, this overlap between these 2 styles of magic, is this actually just a local manifestation of a European trend? Meaning, are actually other books of astral magic displaying ceremonial magic elements in this time period in Europe, but simply nobody noticed, and I'm just looking at a small snapshot? Or is this something, an isolated phenomenon, a specifically Iberian manifestation of astral magic, that something remained here from the 15th century to the 17th century, just developing in isolation here? And this is not an easy question to answer. Now, one way we can use to approach this is to take the shotgun approach. Grab these books and try to compare them with other astral magic books of roughly the same time period and see if we can spot any parallels. We can try to compare magic symbols, magic circles between these books and other books that might have similar symbols. We can try to look for textual parallels or the mentions of specific incantations or specific spirit names between this book and other books, or simply try to find other books who also contain instructions for the creation of statuettes and consecrations of statuettes and see if they match up, which would allow us to try to weave some considerations that would historify these books, make them not be isolated anymore. There are a few places in the world where you can do this type of research. London is one of such places. It has a large collection of magic books at the British Library, but Amsterdam is equally one of these places. And this is due to the existence of the Ritman collection, also called the Biblioteca Filosofica Hermetica. Now, I am not an expert on the history of the Ritman collection, but I can say a few things about it. Now, the Ritman collection was founded by a man called Joost Ritman, an Amsterdam businessman who was fascinated with esoteric and alchemic and hermetic literature and started a collection of books in 1957, which eventually became rather significant, and he ended up opening it to the public in 1984. At its peak, this collection, I heard, had about 28,000 books, many of which extremely rare and valuable manuscripts, which it's very hard to find anywhere else. Now, the history of the Ritman collection isn't a linear and simple one. Again, I am not an expert on these issues. I was not here when this happened. It is my understanding that certain financial troubles with creditors in the Dutch state in 2010 caused the collection to be divided, that the Dutch state came in and took hold of a significant portion of the collection, eventually depositing it in the Royal Library in Den Haag. Fortunately, in more recent years, that section of the collection was relocated to Amsterdam. So the entirety of the collection is in the same city, but in two different institutions. The privately owned section is currently at the House with the Heads in Kruisstraat, where now it's a museum. It's called the Embassy of the Free Mind, and the books are accessible there. And the state-owned section of the collection is at the Allard Pearson Museum, which both are fairly close to each other. You can walk from one to the other. So I was walking through all these buildings for the past few months. So what I was doing here was then to perform exploratory research into this collection. So I ended up looking at about 43 manuscripts present at the Allard Pearson and about 24 at the Embassy of the Free Mind, mostly of them focusing on astral magic, obviously, but also on ceremonial magic, because this was the overlap I was observing, just to see if there was something in these books, in this extensive collection, that would allow me to make sense of these isolated books in Spain. Now, there is immediately, before I go to the conclusions, certain observations that the analysis of this vast collection allowed me to make regarding astral magic in the early modern period, which again seems to be a topic of research somewhat non-popular, or at least something that hasn't been really done, in my opinion. Justice hasn't been done to astral magic beyond the 15th century. So I've come to three conclusions regarding what happens to astral magic after the 15th century. The first of them is simple. that the general principles of astral magic do maintain themselves in the early modern period. I found manuscripts describing how to create talismans and the inscriptions that you're supposed to make in talismans, or the creation of magic statuettes, all of which are coincidental with medieval astral magic. So what was astral magic in the medieval period is still astral magic in the early modern period. People weren't confused by medieval theories on astral magic. However, there are a number of novelties that show up related to astral magic in this period, which were not there in the medieval period. And this is the first one. That while the understanding of astral magic, or the effective power of a talisman in the medieval period, rested on somewhat of a theoretical or abstract notion of planetary influence, meaning not that the planets themselves were theoretical concepts, but the way they affected the world was somewhat theoretical and abstract. What I did observe in the creation of talismans in the early modern period was a downplay of this abstract notion of planetary power and the personalization of this same magical power in the form of planetary spirits, meaning the creation of talismans was not so much to passively attract planetary influences, but to actively attract personifications of planets, meaning spirits that are believed to exist autonomously and be entities in themselves of the non-human nature, that have some kind of relationship with the planet, are under the influence of a planet, or have some kind of relationship with this star. And these planetary spirits can be of several different categories. You have mentions of elementals, genies, intelligences, angels, or spirits. And obviously this depends on the bibliographical preferences of each individual author. Each of these categories will actually have certain theoretical or literary traditions associated with them. Elementals typically refers to Paracelsian philosophy. Angels tend to be more in line with Christian idealism. So all of these reflect several intellectual trends within the early modern period. So what we have is an explicit expansion of astral magic towards non-natural planetary powers. Some of these are actually, these planetary spirits are actually, I found representations of a few of them. The pictorial representations of planetary spirits do seem to be a logical continuation of the representations of planets as present in medieval astral magic, but they also clearly have influences from other literary traditions such as the bestiary tradition and more classical literature. This manuscript, it describes the several forms that planetary spirits might manifest. They might manifest as human beings, and those are the closest to the descriptions of talismans from the medieval period. But then they might also manifest as animals, and those are clearly derived from bestiaries, but also these monstrous traditions, these monstrous forms, which are a bit more ambiguous where they're coming from. Now, the third observation. Let me just skip the page here. So besides this iconographic continuity between medieval astral magic and early modern astral magic, one thing that was very noticeable analyzing descriptions and images of talismans in these early modern texts was that there was clearly a recurrent use of a particular set of symbols, which aren't medieval, and that seemed to indicate a sort of normalized new symbolic vocabulary for astral magic across texts and across authors. Examining these symbols as those present in that particular talisman, I managed to trace these symbols to about 5 distinct and recurrent sources, which are very easily identifiable and known. So where does this new symbolic vocabulary come from? Well, one source is the Heptameron. The Heptameron is a ceremonial magic text. It basically describes a series of rituals meant to evoke the angels of the 7 days of the week. The 7 days of the week have a correspondence with the 7 planets. So it's basically planetary angels. And these are the symbols that are used to call them, and these symbols constantly appear on talismans. Now, obviously, I'm talking about the heptameron. The heptameron is not where these symbols appear. The heptameron is a 16th century text, but the 15th century, we already have these symbols in several manuscripts. I'm talking about the heptameron simply because it is the vehicle by which these symbols are largely propagated through Europe. The heptameron was extremely popular. You even find the heptameron in Portugal, and if it got there, it got everywhere. The second source, a book called the Arbatel. The Arbatel is a Paracelsian text, meaning a text that is written as a continuation of the ideas of Paracelsus. Now, Paracelsus is the pseudonym of an individual called Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, a Swiss physician and one of the major reconceptualizers of medicine in the early modern period. Actually, some concepts we still use in contemporary medicine came out of Paracelsus. He's considered the father of toxicology. But besides medicine, he also wrote extensively on theology and alchemy and magic. And he is fundamental for the creation of the idea of elementals. The Arbatel, not being a Paracelsian work, basically seems to describe the relationship between human beings in several spiritual hierarchies, among which the book refers to as the Olympic spirits, so spirits associated with the planets, and it offers the symbols that you can use to call them, even though the Arbatel is not very explicit in the exact magical methodologies you're supposed to follow in order to summon these spirits, but it still offers them, and these are also very recurrent in the early modern period. Third source, 3 books of occult philosophy by Agrippa. Now, Agrippa is probably one of the more important authors of magic in the early modern period. He basically reconceptualizes magic as a form of as kind of a spiritual discipline for the ascension of the spirit according to a certain Neoplatonic idealism. His 3 books of occult philosophy is his major work, and they are encyclopedic in breadth, containing descriptions of several magical procedures and several issues. And one of the things that this book addresses is sigils of the planets. So it offers seals of the different planets, also seals for the intelligences of the planets, and seals for the spirits of the planet as being distinct things. Fourth source, the Archidoxis Magica, a pseudo-Paracelsian text. So this is a book, a Paracelsian text that is frequently attributed to Paracelsus, although there is no evidence that Paracelsus wrote this book. This book contains several things, certain instructions on alchemy and how to produce tinctures, but also its last part is on talismans, and it contains descriptions of talismans for the 12 signs of the zodiac. And these they look kind of very similar to each other if it's the first time you're looking at them. They're actually, once you get used to them, they're really easy to identify anytime you see them. And finally, the 5th source of this new symbolic vocabulary for astral magic is the Clavicula Salomonis. Now, saying Clavicula Salomonis isn't saying much. Clavicula Salomonis is not a title, it is not a book, it is a literary tradition. These books have their root in the 12th century. They show up around the same time where the 3 categories of magic are formulated. And in fact, these are some of the fundamental texts for the very definition of ceremonial magic. Now, there are hundreds of known manuscripts of the Key of Solomon. A researcher called Robert Matheson tried to categorize them, and he basically found 14 different text groups of Keys of Solomon, so that there are 14 different textual traditions within the Solomonic tradition, many of which have nothing to do with each other, and others do share some content. However, this means that there is a great variety of magical symbolism associated with these books, but I did find a set of symbols present in some Keys of Solomon, some claviculas, which are these, which are also recurrent in early modern textual talismans. And these themselves also contain elements common to the Archidoxis and Agrippa. So these are already, there has been already a process of dialogue for the creation of these symbols. Now, I have identified these sources as being what provides this new language for talismans in the early modern period. But why these 5 sources? That's the question that you have to answer, to ask in this context. Surely, these 5 books were very popular in their time period. They weren't the only popular books of magic in this time period. There were others who were more popular than them. So why these 5 sources? This took me a while to figure out. But it seems that the gathering of these 5 sources does not seem to be a specific development of early modern astral magic, as it is possible to find other documents which already place these 5 sources together in a wider context of planetary correspondences. And this is one of them. The Calendario Natural Mágico Perpetuum, or usually referred to as the magical calendar. Now, this is a 17th century document. It's a very large print, and it is essentially a complex table of correspondences, meaning it makes correspondences between symbols and planets and numbers and elements. It seems to be inspired by Agrippa, although it's not exactly sure where this comes from. There are some theories that this originates in a manuscript in the British Library, Harley 3520. But anyway, if we look at the calendar and we zoom at specific sections, we see right there at the top the Arbatel symbols, right below them the Heptameron symbols, right in the middle the Pentacles of Solomon that I also kept finding in talismans, together with some planetary talismans. This doesn't work. No, some planetary squares, which is actually what Agrippa uses to draw his characters of the planets. You draw those squiggles by connecting numbers and letters within those squares you see here, like these here. And then below that, you have the talismans of the Archidoxes. Not only this, but even the representations of planetary spirits I found, some of them are also visible in the calendar. So, I obviously cannot say that the magical calendar is the main or sole reason why these 5 sources are being recurrently used in early modern astral magic. But what this demonstrates is that these 5 sources have a history of being brought together beyond modern talisman making. This is a standard that is present in the early modern period and is simply being used in new forms of astral magic. So now I'm just going to give some examples of some talismans, some nice images I found, where you have this symbolic overlapping and saturation. So imagine that in the early modern period, a talisman maker wanted to make a talisman of Mars. He will simply try to find as many Martian symbols as he can find and just simply dump them in the same talisman, oftentimes from those 5 sources, but even sometimes extending beyond those 5 sources. These 5 sources are just the more common ones. So this is a perfect example. This is a manuscript that describes the creation of planetary rings. So you have the symbols of the Heptameron together with other planetary symbols, and below the ring you're supposed to draw the symbols of the Arbatel, and you also have angelic and sacred names associated with the planets. Although he actually repeats a few of them, so I don't think he cared too much about the internal logic of everything he was doing. He was just dumping as much symbols as he could in those rings. These are very interesting. This is from a really cool manuscript, it seems to describe a complete and coherent system of working with planetary spirits. And these are some of the talismans that this book prescribes. And you can see they're a bit stylized, which is interesting. Up at the top, you have clearly Arbatel symbols, below them Heptameron symbols, and on the other side of the talismans, you have symbols that seem to suggest strongly Agrippan symbols. Even the dispositions of elements within the central section of the talisman also seem to mimic the Agrippa's description of planetary seals. This is actually a Clavicula Solomonis, where you have talismans with the names of Olympic spirits with Agrippan symbols and Heptameron symbols and Arbatel symbols all together in the same talisman and in the same book. What are the conclusions from this? There are 2 sets of conclusions I can do. One is the general conclusion. So conclusions on the general tendencies of astral magic in the early modern period. So the basic premises of astral magic are maintained in the early modern period. Like I said, what was astral magic in the medieval period is still astral magic in the early modern period. However, there are new ideas and discourses on magic and supernatural forces that push this away from strict naturalism. There is a growing proximity between astral magic and ceremonial magic, which in turn creates an increasing difficulty to talk about astral magic as a distinct form of magic. And I think this is a fundamental point to take into consideration, because the narrative that astral magic loses its popularity in the 15th century, I don't think that's real. Because I don't see people doing any less talismans during the early modern period than they did before. What seems to be happening, in my opinion, is simply that astral magic gets gradually masked under ceremonial magic. There is a change in what astral magic actually is. It becomes more indistinguishable from ceremonial magic, and scholars aren't noticing that. They are simply looking at it and identifying ceremonial magic and not seeing the astral magic reasoning behind what these magicians are supposed to be doing. Planets and stars, in whatever capacity they might be mentioned, become aggregation points for symbols and distinct understandings of supernatural forces. So every time a planet is mentioned in a text, be it on magic or any other esoteric discipline, this becomes a motive or a central point by which all sorts of symbols can get dumped into, and these symbols are sourced not only from these 5 sources, but from other documents that are bringing these symbols together in Neoplatonic fashion, such as the magical calendar and other books and texts like that. Now, the second set of conclusions. What can this say about the Iberian case, where we started? Unfortunately, during the current study, no direct iconographic or textual continuities were detected between Iberia and the rest of Europe. However, the phenomena that characterize astral magic in Europe are not absent in the Iberian case. The meaning that while in the 17th century in Iberia we were clearly seeing an overlap between astral and ceremonial magic, this same phenomenon appears to be happening in Europe. However, there is a problem in making a strict connection between these 2 points. That, like I said, my texts are from the 17th century, and the majority of the Rittmann collection is from the 18th century. So there's about 100 years difference between these 2 books, between these 2 ideas on astral magic. But they do seem to make sense together. We can look at the 17th century mild overlaps, although explicit, between astral and ceremonial magic, and observe a much more normalized version of this happening in Europe in the 18th century with already a new formalized magical language. But even still, the non-dismissible particularities of my Iberian texts remain historically obscure, but such texts appear to follow the same trends which characterize astral magic in the early modern period. While guaranteeing a common participation in a broad intellectual and historical context, more research is demanded on these Iberian manuscripts. So that's my problem, not yours, obviously. Thank you. Now, before I go, there's one thing I'd like to add. And we have time.
There will be questions also.
I know, but just
You can't go.
This is important. Joost Rittmann passed away not 2 weeks ago. I never met Joost Rittmann. I never had a conversation with him. But in his way, he was fundamental for this project, as he was fundamental for many other projects, past and future, and will surely be responsible for many projects to come. However meaningless or meaningful this is, since I did not know the man, I would still like to dedicate the presentation to Joost Rittmann.